Those of you who aren't finished, I hope the teams are working well. I hope everybody's contributing to the results of the teams. You've got another lab on Tuesday, and you've got both Saloni and Matthew are going to be at that lab section, so that'll end up being great. Please don't get into a mode of sending out questions on Thursday night, basically saying, I'm having trouble with this particular problem, etc. You may or may not end up getting the answer, so it's good to be able to make progress on this. I assume everybody has learned about the file operations, understands about basic C++ stuff, and Valgrind and debugging techniques and all the rest of it. So we have now gotten 1/5 of the way through the term to approximately 2 weeks. And we've gotten fairly deep into some stuff, and we're going to be looking at different file organizations. So we went over B trees, including not only search, but also insert and delete. And again, as we discussed, the B trees stay balanced. And I was asked a question at the end of class, which I want to reemphasize the answer to. If data comes in time order, you don't end up with a B+ tree that's leaning all the way over to the right or leaning over to the left. The techniques that we showed make sure that the depth of the tree is going to be locked to the base F, or locked to the base F/2, which is still locked to the base F, of the number of leaves, of the space that you have in the leaves, and the number of nodes in the leaves. And that's going to happen even when the data comes in pretty much in order. It might feel to you like it's going to lean over to the side, but the operation that we showed that happened on insertion and keeping everything balanced, meaning that it's locked to the base F of n. It's not completely balanced. The number of things is not exactly the same on all sides, but it is going to stay locked to the base F of basically the number of entries that you have in the bottom if all the leaves were filled. So that's all going on. So we went over B trees, we went over hashing, and the version of hashing that we went over was static hashing, in which you end up having data that's stored in the hash table, and if things don't fit inside your hash bucket, that's the hash table, there will be overflow buckets. Then we talked about 3 different ways that data entries can be stored. The easiest way, not always the best way, of storing your data entries is to have the entries actually be the records. Now, that takes more space than if you just had something where you had a key and an RID. But it can be done that way, but unless you want to have the data stored twice, you can only do that for one index, for one way of storing the data entries, because if you're storing the data, so if you want to do it 2 different ways, you have to store the data 2 or 3 or 17 times. That's one approach. The K is the search key. Don't confuse it with primary key. K is the search key. K store the data entries, which may be the data. But the data could the things you have in the data entries could also be, and these two are really pretty much the same, something where you store the RIDs that are associated with the data. The search key and the RIDs that correspond to it. Well, sometimes there's only one search key that corresponds, there's only one entry that corresponds to a search key. If the search key happens to be a primary key or happens to be something else that's unique, there would only be one value. Well, those, of course, being tricky on that. But if it's a primary key, then there can only be one thing that corresponds to that search key, if the search key is a primary key. If the search key is unique, again, there can't be any duplicate values except for nulls. So again, the 2 ways of dealing with K star, that is the data entries, are have the key and the RID, the key and the RID, the key and the RID, which means that if we have 20,000 people whose state is California, we'll have 20,000 and the first, California and the first, California and the second, California and the third, California ... up to all 20,000, which means we're storing California 20,000 times. Another approach that doesn't mean there are quite so many Californias, or to contemplate 20,000 Californias. Another way of doing it is to say, we'll just store the California, the search key once, and then the list of the RIDs. And that has the advantage that you only store the search key once, and the disadvantage that you have to store a list rather than just a simple RID. So you'd have to be able to understand how long the list is, and you have variable length stuff in there, but that can be a better way, in terms of storing space and saving space. And whether you're doing hashing or B-tree indexing or R-tree indexes or other stuff that we'll be talking about, I mean, there are lots of different access paths. We're focusing on trees and B-trees and also on hashing. We'll talk about one or two other styles of approaches. But the question as to whether or not you store the actual data or you store the RIDs that enable you to find the data is orthogonal to the choice of the access path. And all that orthogonal means is you get to pick which approach, 1, 2, or 3, alternative 1, 2, or 3. You want to use whatever the access path is. So you can go with any of these approaches. So number one, the data is stored inside the records. And if the records are very large, then you're going to have lots and lots and lots of leaves that are there. And so your next level up has to, have a lot of stuff in it, because it's got to be able to point to the leaves. Alternatives 2 and 3 are really very close cousins, as I've said. And again, the advantage of 3 is it saves space, but you have to keep track of something more complicated because it's variable lengthless. It could also be variable length data. Not only the records could be variable length, but the search keys sometimes are variable length. And a question that I want to mention, and I want to mention the answer to you right now. Do you actually, when you have the traffic cops in your B-trees, and also for that matter, when you store your entries inside the leaves, do you actually have to have the full search key? Think about the question that I'm asking. Do the traffic cops have to be a full search key? We've already seen last time that the traffic cops could be values that had been in the tree at some point, but they got deleted. But they're still perfectly good traffic cops. Less than this, go to the left, greater or equal to it, go to the right. And it could be a value that's no longer there, and that ends up being okay. And for the things that the traffic cops, that is, the values that are in the non-leaf nodes, all the traffic cop has to do is direct you left or right. So if you have a prefix, let's say of a character string thing, that allows you to direct left or right, a prefix that allows you to direct left or right is good enough to be able to make that work. In the leaves, you actually want to usually have the precise values so you know whether you found it or didn't. There are variations of it that get played with, but you usually want to have the actual values. And again, if you have a variable length search key, then you have to be able to cope with that in all the alternatives as well.
Question, on the alternative 1, you said the number of leaves are going to be much larger when the data records are...
The number of leaves is going to be larger because you're storing the data, not just the search keys and the RIDs.
But why would the number of leaves for alternative 2 and 3 be a little smaller?
Because
the leaves will be smaller itself.
So think of it this way. A record might be, let's say, 3,000 bytes, hundreds of bytes, even thousands of bytes. That's what you have to store inside the leaves if you're following alternative 1. You need to store the search key and the record. Thousands and thousands of bytes. How big is what you store as a data entry if you're following alternatives 2 and 3? You're basically storing key and RID. An RID is just page ID and slot ID. The key, 8 bytes, 3 bytes, if it's compressed, might even be 6 bits or something of whatever sort. So the number of pages is going to depend on the size of what you put in the data entries. The data entries are going to be very, very big if you're storing the records, and the records happen to be hundreds or thousands of bytes. The data entries are going to be much smaller if all you're storing is the RIDs. And therefore, the number of pages that you have, as we'll soon see, is going to be much bigger when you actually have the data records. Right, and therefore the number of things one level up is going to have to, point to the things down below and distinguish between them, and so you end up having to have basically you're pointing to more things. So take an extreme case. Suppose that record length was not quite but close to 4 bytes. You'd have 1 page for every record. Therefore, you'd have to distinguish between all those pages below at the next level up. And so you'll have to have more things at that, not that level up, because you're only distinguishing one thing. So you're gonna have traffic cops for each one of the records. That's gonna be more than if I had 133 or 200 fitting on a page. That's the reason why.
Gotcha, thanks.
Okay, now, this is where we stopped last time. As I hurriedly mentioned, these are things that we're gonna spend some time talking about today. And there are two types of indexes you can have. Primary and secondary is an easy one to think of. Primary is an index that corresponds to the primary key. Generally, there will be an index that corresponds to the primary key. Why is that? I'll give you two answers, one of which I would have given years ago, and the other I would have given years ago also, but I'll still actually fervently say now. One of the reasons that you want to have a primary key is that you want to be able to do lookups based on the primary key just to be able to find whether or not the value exists. And that's still sort of true today. Actually, that's the one that continues very much to be true today. If I'm inserting a record, primary key is supposed to be unique. I can't put in two students that have the same cruise ID. I don't want to have to search through all my records to find out whether or not there's somebody who already has that cruise ID. And so having an index allows me to figure that out relatively quickly. Especially because the top layers of the index, the top levels are likely to be in memory, maybe even the whole index. So having the index makes that easier for me rather than having to scan through the records. And so uniqueness is an important thing to check quickly. Scanning and finding a range of values, these days, again, as I've emphasized, scanning is much more prevalent than it used to be. I'm more willing to be able to scan because I can scan very quickly. So indexes to prevent having to scan used to be incredibly important, not just for primary key indexes, but any index. Uniqueness is still important. And in fact, there will always, in systems I'm familiar with, be a primary key index. You don't even get to create it in a lot of systems. The system will create it for you because it has to make sure that constraint that there aren't two is maintained. It's an old movie called Highlander. There can only be one. When you have a primary key, there can only be one. So there will be an index on the primary key. There are typically also end up often being things that correspond to foreign keys to be able to do lookups, but that's a separate thing. And often when you have unique, there are often indexes as well. But we'll call something a primary index if the search key contains the primary key. Why do I say contains the primary key? Suppose that the primary key is attributes A and B. You could choose to have an index on A, B, C as well, which might be useful, and we'll see. There are some queries that you can answer just using indexes without touching the data, because the index gives you enough information. So you could choose to have an index on A, B, C, and that'll ensure that there's a unique value of A, B. But it'll also help you see whether or not there's something that corresponds to A, B, C. So basically, if something is a primary key, if the search key is a superset of the primary key, in order, what do I mean by that? If AB is the primary key, then AB is good. ABC is good. But CAB is not. Because finding out whether or not AB is unique is hard to do if I have an index on CAB. Not impossible, but kind of expensive. Okay, so primary key, the search key contains the primary key at the beginning. And it's okay if it's AB or if it's BA. Either of those is okay. ABC is okay, BAC is okay, CAB is not if AB is the primary key. And it's called a unique index if it's an index on something which is unique, basically. Because there can only, again, be one value, other than, again, nulls. Nulls are an exception on uniqueness. So that's a pretty easy one. Primary key, unique, secondary. Secondary, basically not primary. Here's the one that's a little more complicated. And it has to do with the order of the data versus the order of the index. Suppose that, this could be hard to do, but let's just take a simple example. Suppose that my data is an age order. I've got a sorted file which is being maintained in age order. Kind of expensive to do, but suppose I do that. And I have an index on age. That would be called a clustered or clustering index. Why? Because if I march through a range of ages, how many times am I going to find a data page? I have indexes based on age. I'm looking for people between 20 and 25. I get the 20-year-olds. They're on a range of pages. Then I get the 21-year-olds. They're on a range of pages. Am I ever going to go back to an earlier page? How many think the answer is yes, that I will go back to an earlier page?
What do you mean by an earlier page?
I've touched all the pages that correspond to age 20. And now I'm on the age 21. And the data is ordered by age. I've touched the 20 pages. I've touched, P40, P41, P42, and now P42 also has some people who are age 21. And now I'm on the 21 pages. Am I ever going to go back to P40?
No.
No, because the data is ordered by age. I will only touch each data page once. I will walk through the index. The index is on age. So I will be going through the index, touching the index pages. I will be touching data pages. And when I leave a data page, I ain't never going back. Never be together again, to quote Taylor Swift. You're never going to go back to a page. You're never going to go back, bad jokes or us. You're never going to touch a page again because the order of the index and the order of the pages are the same. What if the data was ordered by name? And I'm looking up people based on age. The data is ordered in alphabetical order based on name. And I'm looking up the people based on the ages. I'm looking at the people between 20 and 25. Bing, 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 bing. It's throwing darts at a dartboard. You keep touching pages and coming back to other pages because the data is ordered by name. I'll look at the people who are age 20. Pages could be all over the place because the names are going to be all over the place and the data is ordered by name. Whereas with the age, if the data was ordered by age, I'm never going to go back to a page. When the data is ordered by name, I'll be touching pages a lot of different times, bouncing all around the data in all sorts of ways. And that's the difference between clustered and non-clustered, or clustering and non-clustered, or unclustered. Lots of synonyms, but you get the idea. Clustered, I will never touch a page again when I'm done with it, because the data is in the same order as the index. As I march through the index, I'm marching through the data. I may not be touching all the pages. I'm only looking at the people 20 to 25. I may or may not be touching all the pages, but with the non-clustered or unclustered index, bing, 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 jumping all over the place. So here's the nice thing. If I'm using alternative one, the index is the data, and the data is the index. It's clustered by definition. Okay? And in practice, unless I'm keeping my data sorted, which is painful, if it's clustered, it usually corresponds, but not always, corresponds to alternative one, because otherwise it's a pain. We'll talk about how expensive it is to maintain sorted files. When I say that a file can be clustered on at most one search key, unless I'm replicating my data, my clustering is in one order. I can't order on both name and age. Well, unless people were named in age order, which doesn't happen. Even things like country abbreviation and country name are, it's not alphabetical order, it's not the same. So it's very unusual to have things that happen to be clustered on more than one set of attributes. It'd be quite a coincidence. It can happen, it's very unusual. The reason that we're making a big deal about clustering and non-net clustering is the cost of retrieving data depends hugely on whether or not about the index that we're using, which might be a B tree, might be also hashing, but it varies hugely. And by the way, clustered and hashing don't usually go together. The clustered versus non-clustered on B tree is very important. If you have a clustering index, the cost of range queries in particular is going to be a whole lot better. Or doing a complete scan of all the data is going to be a lot better if I have a clustering than if I have a non-clustering index. And that's why we're emphasizing. Now here's a picture that shows you what I just said. But now the picture should be very clear based on what we just said. Suppose that I use alternative 2, and again, alternative 2 and alternative 3 are very similar. And suppose that the data is stored as a heap, meaning no particular order on the data, it's not sorted. And we have an index on it, okay? And I want to build a clustered index based on that. So what I can do is I can take the data and I can go ahead and I can build a clustered index. And remember that we're going to be usually using alternative 1 for that, but we're going to be sorting the data, and if it's clustered, I can just go ahead and sort the data and build the leaves of the index that correspond to that. I will generally, in practice, want to leave some free space on the data pages, which again are the leaves of the index. Why do I want to do that? You cram everything together, it takes less space. I've got a problem if I want to do an insert on a page that's full. So I will typically want to leave some free space. That's important. You'd say not having free space means I don't have to read as many pages. But again, inserting becomes a pain because I'll have to get a new page in the middle, which I can do. Pages don't have to be fully ordered, but it's just annoying to have that. In practice, you'll want to have a certain amount of free space there. Of course, it could get filled up, but I'll start off with some free space inside. So I'll build a clustering index, by sorting the thing, then my leaves correspond to it, and then I'll build the next levels up with the index. My traffic cops tell me when to go left and when to go right. Less go left, greater or equal to go right. And of course, there are a lot of traffic cops in each one of these things. It's not just that they're left and right. It's not a binary tree. It's something in where you might have 133 traffic cops in the thing. A reminder again, the number of keys that you have, the number of traffic cop values that you have is one less the number of page pointers, right? Because you're going to have, less than, greater than, so it's going to be 1 1. Okay, so you're just going to go ahead and do that, and you'll have free space to deal with the inserts. It may be that as time goes on, that you're going to have to see about what happens when you have to create new pages. And if you have to create new pages, well, when I created this, remember my stuff about next on disk, where I don't want to yank the head around or the arm around any more than I have to? This is great for next when I end up building it. I can get new pages when I have to insert things in the middle, but my next stuff may not be that good to get things that are consecutive from the disk. But I can go ahead and I can build that. What happens when I have an unclustered index? Well, remember, I can have clustering index on one attribute, or again, it can be a multi-attribute tree, right? It can be a tree on ABC, not just on A or on AB. It can be on ABCD. I can have an index on however many attributes I want. But I can't have multiple things that are going to end up being created where everything is ordered. So here, the green is the data records. These are the data entries that point to the data records. Again, 3 things here: the non-leaf parts of the tree, the data entries, and the actual data. And if it's clustered, the data will often be right up there. The data will often end up being there. If I'm using alternative 2, then I've created this with the data not actually being stored, but the ordering, matching at the beginning. Life gets kind of interesting as new things get put in. What's going on in unclustered? The data is in the order in which the data is in, whatever the heck that is. And I will have to have things where my data entries point to where the data records are, and they'll be all over the place in the example I gave you. The data is ordered by name. It might not be ordered at all. The data is ordered by name, and bing, 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 all over the place, right? Because if I have an index on age, I get the people who are 20, who could be all over the place, and people who are 21, who again could be all over the place. So again, unclustered means I'm just gonna have to keep going back to the same page lots and lots and lots. And maybe the page is gonna be in memory, and maybe it's not gonna be in memory. In the old days, there was a really good chance the data wasn't in memory. These days, with really large memories, there's a much better chance that it's gonna be hanging around in memory, but you're not necessarily guaranteed that it's in memory unless you do something where you actually make sure you have more memory than data, which ends up being interesting. So we're gonna be doing some ugly old style analysis. And in the code, I'll be pointing you to 4 papers that do some more interesting analysis. I'll be telling you just briefly about something called the 5-minute rule, where there are 4 papers that were written 10 years apart from each other. One of them in the last 3 years, that talk about analysis of costs and how much memory you should have versus hardware. And so the book does do some discussion, still not current, about CPU costs. Just to keep it simple here, we're gonna be looking at disk/SSD cost. But I will emphasize again, this is old style analysis. The book has some limited, still old style CPU cost discussion that in some ways is better than what we're gonna be doing here. But I would really urge you, some of you, to read those 5-minute rule papers because you'll find them fascinating and current. One of them more than 30 years old, another 20 years old, another 10 years old, and another just several years old. Because that'll tell you more about where the technology is now. So in the numbers we're doing, and I'll spend less time on this than I usually do because it is kind of out of date. The number of data pages is going to be called B, not a block size. It's going to be the number of data pages. The number of records that can fit on a page is going to be called R. D is going to be the time to read or write a disk page, and we won't be assuming that things fit inside memory, which again is not that great an assumption these days. F is the fan out. Remember, you have fan out, the number of kids you get to have, and remember that on average it'll be at least F. It'll be half of the maximum that it could be because of the way we're playing with preserving things in B trees. We're going to count the number of IOs. Okay. And we're going to be doing some simple, really ugly average case analysis. The detailed stuff is much, much better. It will take a lot of time to go over. Again, I suggest you read those 5-minute rule papers. CPU costs are not ignored now. And again, the assumption is that a lot of stuff ends up really fitting inside memory. There are people who go to the trouble of trying to make sure that everything fits inside memory for certain types of relations. There are other cases where it just fits in memory because you keep touching it, and memory costs are just so much cheaper than they used to be. So there are going to be 5 different organizations we're going to look at, and there are going to be 5 costs that we're going to analyze. So it's going to be a 5x5 matrix. What are the 5 organizations we're going to look at? The 5 that are listed on the slide. We're going to be looking at heap files in which you're just doing insertion at the end. We're just going to put things into the heap file in no particular order. There's going to be the sorted file where, let's say we assume that we sort on a combination of the attributes age and salary. By the way, in practice, nobody stores age. Why? Because you don't want to change the age when somebody has a birth date. You store the birth date, you never store age. Your birth date never changes. Your age, happy birthday! Let's go through all the darn thing. No. But it's a simple example, and even the book uses it. And so, having made the disclaimer, as I did in 180, I'll continue to use age because it's a simple example. Nonsense, but a simple example. Okay, and then remember clustering? Since it was on 2 slides back, I hope you do. Clustering says that the order of the data and the order of the index are the same. That data is stored in the same layers. It's a multi-attribute index. You store the data based on age and then salary. Tie for the age, it's going to be increasing order of salary. Okay, and it's going to be alternative 1 with age and salary. The data, in this case, it's clustered, so you will really be storing the data based on age and salary. Those are going to be the data increase. Of course, when we have the clustered, unclustered is following right behind. So now we're gonna assume that it's, stored, either it's stored as a heap, whatever order, and we have an unclustered index on age and salary. And last one, we'll have a hash index, and again, clustering on hashing is not something that you normally go ahead and do, because caching stinks on range quarters, and clustering is important for ranges, typically. Okay, so it can be important, a little bit important for equality, mostly it's important on ranges. And so here are the operations. I said it's a 5x5 matrix that we are entering, here it is. The 5 operations are scan, fetching all the records that correspond to this relation. All the records in the relation, number 1. Number 2, check for equality. Find the things that equal a particular value in a search key. You have a fixed value of age and salary, find all the records that correspond to that age and salary. There could be a bunch of them. A bunch of people could have the same age and salary. A range query. Look for all the people with age between this age and that age. Or look for all the people who are age 21 and have a salary between 10,000 and 50,000. So that would be examples of range queries. And we'll talk about, which sorts of range queries can be dealt with by which sorts of indexes. We'll get into that more later when we start talking about optimization. Insert a record. Delete a record. An update can be treated as a delete and an insert. So we're not ignoring updates, it just can be treated as a delete and an insert. Although remember, you only have to, when you have an update, you only have to mess with the indexes that correspond to the updated columns. So if I change somebody's name and I have an index on age and column, I don't have to mess with that index. Okay. Okay, assumptions for the analysis. Many of these can be argued with, but this gets complicated enough even with the simple, stupid, old assumptions we're using. We'll assume that when we have the heap file, that when we do equality, we'll assume that there's only one value that corresponds to the search key. It wouldn't be hard to change it to have multiple values, but that helps explain some oversimplification in the matrix we're about to see. I can tell you how to modify it if there could be more than one. It's really easy. And with a heap file, we'll assume no index to mess with, so you have to go through the whole heap. In the case of a sorted file, we will assume that when things get deleted, that you actually delete the record, same as what you have to do in project 1. So, in practice, you might just mark the record as it's not really there. It may look like it's there, but it's not really there. We'll assume for this analysis, we could do it the other way, but we'll assume for this analysis that the file, when something gets deleted, it gets compacted down and everything gets moved up. In the case of clustering, we'll assume alternative 1, where the record's sitting in the leaves of the B tree. Okay. And that's again going to be called clustered. And in the case of the unclustered, and we'll have 2 unclustered cases with a B plus tree and with a hash index. We'll assume that the data actually is in both cases, that the data is stored in a heap. And in the case of the indexes, whether it's a B tree or a hash, we'll assume that alternative 2 or 3 are used. You can't use alternative 1. This alternative 1 would make it clustered rather than unclustered. So again, in the case of the 2 unclustered things, the data is stored in a heap, but there's an index that allows you to find that data more easily. And we'll talk about what the analysis is. And this is a slide that we're going to come back to, because it's kind of complicated, but I want to walk you through this so that when we fill in that 5x5 matrix, the things in that matrix will make some sense to you. We'll spend a little bit of time on this one. It'll pay off when we get later. Okay, we will assume, you gotta make sense.